Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Econ Playground. We've got two longtime guests, but always welcome. We've got Caleb Petitt and Tegan Truitt, and we're going to be talking about an essay that Tegan has been talking to us about for a long time now called Entering Through Death, Living with Doubt. And it's a chapter in the book Ritualized Faith on the Philosophy of Liturgy by a guy named Terence Cuneo, who, if I'm correct, he's Eastern Orthodox, but he's primarily a philosopher. Oh, look, it says right here, he's the Marsh Professor of Intellectual and Moral Philosophy at the University of Vermont. At least he was at the time this book was written.
Yeah, I think he's still there.
Okay, cool. Well, Tegan, just tell us what you like so much about this essay and why it's so interesting to you.
Yeah, so I came across this essay shortly after I began considering baptism and talking to my priest about that. And I came across it in a philosophy of religion class that I took with a professor at Grove City College, who's now a very, very dear friend of mine, a really, really amazing guy. But yeah, he assigned this essay, and it struck me for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it presents religious belief specifically, as a matter of choice. He's very explicit when when Cuneo is articulating his reasons for joining the Orthodox Church. He's very explicit that it wasn't like he was overwhelmed by a realization or anything like that. Rather, he had realization and decided to make a choice based on that realization. But it's not like some kind of incontrovertible evidence suddenly just like shifted his mind or something like that. And the second thing is that choice that he makes is passional. It's like based fundamentally about his desires. And so he's relying on his emotions to gain moral knowledge about the world, which is a really interesting, and I don't think it's at all a unique or novel thing, but it's abnormal in our kind of morally stunted world that we live in now to trust the emotions to guide us like that. So that was like the second thing that I thought was really intriguing about it. And then thirdly, it has a very sophisticated discussion of how we as religious believers deal with holding belief as a choice and not as a matter of being overwhelmed by some kind of incontrovertible evidence. And specifically, he reframes belief in terms of commitment, and very explicitly says, like when he recites the Nicene Creed each Sunday liturgy, he's not necessarily sure if he always believes it, at least in a certain sense in which we use belief. He's got this explanation of the conventional way in which we use that word belief involves detailing our levels of surprise at discovering something to be true or false. So he uses the example of grapefruits. He says he would be very surprised to discover that grapefruits weren't fibrous. He's like very confident in that. And he'd probably be less surprised to discover that Jesus did not, as a matter of fact, rise from the dead or something like that. But he would be deeply dismayed were he to discover the falsity of the central dogmas of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And it is on account of that dismay that he commits himself to Christianity again and again every Sunday by reciting the creed and in all the other ways. So those three things taken together, belief as choice, emotions as moral guides, and belief as commitment renewed regularly as opposed to logically derived conclusion or something like that, were all just super intriguing to me when I read it and really resonated with me as I discerned and ultimately decided to be baptized.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's look at those each one a little bit closer. But just one metaphor that I thought of while you were talking there was people sometimes treat their what would you call it, hesitant to join a more comprehensive set of religious doctrines, even if they have those same kind of desires and emotions that you were talking about, because it feels like earmarks on a bill for like Congress, where it's like, yeah, well, so there's these people who like they want to pass this bill that says that we believe there's a God and he's in three persons, and then he died and rose for us. But then like some like constituency like really wants like the ever virginity of Mary, so they like get that like tied in there so that they can get all the votes in together. And now we all have to like have this ever virginity thing. It's like, do we need it? Like, why is it here? And I feel like I'm committing to things that I don't need to, and then accidentally like have a war over it or something. So
Yeah.
it's it feels awkward to do something like that, especially if it's something you didn't grow up in. So it's much easier for the person at the margin who's choosing whether or not to step in has a totally different choice set in front of them as someone who would be choosing to step out, right?
Yeah,
Which is also very interesting.
That is an interesting point. And I will say that concern that you raised is probably, I would say, the reason why I'm Anglican and not Orthodox myself.
Well, because of the ever virginity?
No, not the ever virginity. Not that in particular. The point you raised about you're marking, right? Where it's like you have all these different theological commitments that you've got to hold. And you're like, you're not sure about all of them. And so that is a real barrier to commitment. And Anglicanism, relative to almost any other denomination of Christianity, as far as I know, has like the lowest kind of benchmark number of beliefs that you have to hold to be an Orthodox member of the church in good standing.
I mean, that's why the difference between dogmas and doctrines, and then I recently learned about the category of disciplines too, is even different than doctrines, right? Which is they make more explicit in the Catholic Church because they care about that a lot. So like, for example, the celibacy of priests in the Catholic Church is not a discipline. Dogma, it's a discipline, right? It's basically saying bishops don't let your priests marry, and bishops like also get together on things like, so actually bishops being unmarried might be a dogma, that might be in one of the councils, I don't know. It's certainly a discipline at some point in this 7th, 8th century. They had established that bishops would, but only in the West they required total celibacy of priests by the 11th, 12th centuries. But yeah, so just these different levels of things. So dogma would be all the things that you have to believe to be considered Orthodox. And if you start to agitate against one of those things, then your priest would be obligated to excommunicate you or something like that. Like I just read, or I was just listening to Peugeot talk to a guy, and he just said this. I haven't looked it up or I know anything about it, nor have I thought through it, but that the word heresy means choice somehow.
Oh, interesting.
So I don't know if it means it in Greek. Do you know more about that, Caleb?
No, I don't.
Okay, yeah, I guess it just, but you feel like faith means choice, or to believe means choice, like as we're talking about. So it's not that all choices are heresies, but it's that it's maybe you giving yourself the power of discrimination over a tradition is heresy. That's where the choice lies, where with I get to choose which councils I support personally. So one person saying, oh, we accept all this but not this, is a heretic.
So like turning dogmas into a choice, it would be something that makes you a heretic, right? So it's something that should be concrete, something that should be the frame which you use to see everything. Turning that into a choice breaks down the entire system. So it's like kicking out the wall of the sandbox instead of rearranging the sand within the sandbox.
You can maybe also, if you think about, but if you want to think about why that's wrong, because it sounds like maybe that's a good idea sometimes, like to be able to choose certain things. If you think about it like a relationship with a person, right? So if Tegan was a heretic with respect to Bethany, it's like, well, I like this part of Bethany, I don't like this part of Bethany, so I'm going to choose this part and then just like push the other part out. You can't have a relationship with someone and have a heretic within your heresy within your relationship, because and basically it's we shouldn't treat it's also pointing people to the direction that what the church is not a list of dogma. That's part of the church, but doesn't summarize the church.
Right. Absolutely.
So if you do treat the dogma as something that you can have a heresy over, you misunderstand what you're dealing with, and you end up ripping apart things you didn't intend to. Right. So that's part of it. Yeah,
and it's interesting. Cuneo uses exactly that analogy, exactly that metaphor of a spousal relationship. to describe commitment to the church. He says in the church he finds things that he dislikes that like are not necessarily to his taste or whatever, but those are not sufficient to keep him from joining, affirming commitment, belonging to the church. For exactly the same reason that there are all sorts of things about his wife he doesn't like, but those are not sufficient to keep him from affirming his relationship with her, joining that union, belonging to her.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose you could just have enough things that you don't like about a person that you just never marry them in the first place, and that's probably the case with a lot of people not wanting to join the church, right?
Yeah. But I think he has a good point there with like, if you're always just looking for something to keep you out, you can always find something. But if you see it as a commitment and something that you're never going to find, you're never going to see what you're committing to as being perfect, but you can embrace that despite those flaws or those differences and learn how to interact with them properly. This is a little bit tangential, but kind of related. He talks about how like when you're trying to engage with a commitment or a religious belief, it might be imperfect, but then you have to go, okay, well, compared to what? So what happens if I don't do this? It has certain problems, certain hangups that I have with it, but it's still better than the alternative of not doing it. I think Jordan Peterson talks about how there was like this atheist guy he was talking to, and he, complained about Christmas and why would we have Christmas? It's just like an arbitrary day where we like celebrate over nothing, because he's an atheist, so he doesn't believe in nativity or anything. But then he came around and goes like, okay, well, so if we get rid of Christmas, now we just have one less good day of the year. We're just making everything else normal. And so like you can have your hangups or your problems with something, but you can still like engage with it because you see the light and the joy and the beauty that comes from it.
Yeah, like I was just the other night at this party of a bunch of people that were, I guess, presumably most of them were not Christian, right? And this guy was like, oh, let's do this pagan ritual. This is kind of related to your comment, but it just really made me think of it, and I want to talk about it. He was like, let's do this pagan ritual. And I was like, so what, how do you know it's pagan? And he was like, oh, I have some pagan friends and they told me about it. But which I have no idea what that means. But basically the whole thing was you would have a campfire and then you write something that you want to take with you and you want to leave behind in the year, and something you want to take with you in the year, right? And oh yeah, I was telling you about this the other day, Kill. And then you just like write them on the piece of paper and then burn it, right? And then
that
I was like,
seem like especially pagan.
Yeah, I don't think it is.
It's not pagan at all.
Very much a ritual. That's a very like kind of shallow skeleton ritual there.
Yeah. But they got really into it because I think some people are like, they don't know what they're missing. But I realized that if I had recommended like, what if we prayed about it, people would get like creeped out, because it's got that level of ritual without that feeling of commitment to everything. So modern paganism is a lot of people realizing what they're missing, but also refusing to take on all of the aspects of it,
Oh, that's very interesting.
So yeah, it's them being like heretics with respect to something like modern pagans really have a certain kind of modern progressive Christian derived set of ethics that they add on a mystical level that of everything that they happen to choose, right? And the putting themselves in the position that it's, oh well, all of those things are just metaphors or something like that, puts them in a position of power. So claiming things are metaphors gives you the power over over legitimate truth in that way. Yeah,
that's interesting.
So it ends up not being received wisdom because you can choose what you receive.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of you have like the Larry Seaton Top and Tom Hollis thesis talking about how Christianity brings in like modern Western morals and stuff. Now, as we see liberalism or kind of religiosity declining in the West, you have to figure out what exactly you're going to do with the ethical framework that you've been given by Christianity, while it's being completely removed from the spiritual world that it's designed to inhabit. And so, some people going the way of Nietzsche and just completely rejecting the morals completely. But this seems like something where you realize that you value the ethical framework, but it requires something more, some kind of engagement with the spiritual. But then you've been like burned on church for some reason, and so you're trying to find like another way to re-spiritualize the Christian moral and ethical framework without making it Christian.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's that sense of I left that already because of all the baggage, and they don't want anything to bring it back. But we are also, of course, reading psychologically into a lot of people here, which is kind of rude. So you've got to like let them speak of themselves. But that is a pattern, obviously, to notice worldwide, and it's also something inside each one of us where I'm sure there's particular earmarks on dogma that we're like, why is that there? Why do I need to believe that, or something like that? Yeah. Okay, let's go back to what you were talking about, Tegan, with beliefs as choice. What exactly do you mean by that?
It means that there are some beliefs that we hold, which we do in fact hold as a matter of choice, and not because we were overwhelmed with evidence for their truth or falsity. So you might think of like there are beliefs, there are propositions that we can suspend judgment about, right? Like I could say it was raining here exactly 2,000 years ago, true or false, and you would say, I don't know, man. I don't have a belief about that one way or another. And that's perfectly legitimate, because that seems like the sort of thing that only evidence could decide for you, and you don't have the evidence on it. And I think this is a lot more, this is tacit in cuneo, and not explicit. But I think William James, which obviously you know more about than I do, would have a really, really good way of helping cuneo out here, or making explicit that which is tacit in cuneo, which is the idea of an option being forced, a belief being forced upon you. And that arises in the situation where logically you are in either one of two discrete categories, and there's no middle ground between. Or three, yeah.
Just a discrete set of categories,
yeah. A discrete set of categories that's not a continuum. And so the belief is thus forced upon you. A choice of belief is forced upon you because you automatically fall into one of those categories no matter what you do. And thus you are stuck in a situation where you are holding a belief as a matter of choice, even and especially when the evidence is insufficient to compel you one way or another.
And especially if the case is that this option is a new option somehow, where you can't just inherit your former belief. You can't just have the inertia of that belief move forward. So if I'm at position A, right, but there's no evidence against B and no evidence for A, but I'm already at A and I've already answered every single time I've reached this situation, I've answered with A, I might just stay, in A. I'll stay, I'll keep answering with A. There's kind of an inertia to it. But if I reach an option between C and D, which I've never considered before, I actually have to do some kind of there has to be some action of choice. Something has to happen there. And along what lines do I make that sort of choice, right? It's actually, it's almost like a hard wall in econ, because in econ, all of choice theory relies on understanding what your relative ranking of certain situations would be, given that you do some kind of choice, right? Yeah. So this is where something like game theory comes into closer play, because it's like you're playing a game against nature. So I can choose A or B, and then the real conditions of the world are A or B. And then you can just, if you assign weights to those desires, doing A or doing B, or the relative cost of these things, and then just assign a probability distribution to what you think nature is going to play, then you can logically solve the problem. But that real question is how you generate that probability distribution. So assuming that everyone has a probability distribution over which they act assumes away the problem that sometimes there are choices in beliefs that we do not have a logical way of implying how people would behave in certain areas. And then the skill of how do you know what to do, or especially in between people, how do you share information about the truth? Which is why McCloskey turns so much towards rhetoric, because which I haven't read every time. One time when I actually talked to McCloskey, and other people that I talk to about what I like in McCloskey, they always say to read her, I think 1996 book, Knowledge and Persuasion in Economics, which is her most like theoretical work about her rhetoric stuff, which I just haven't cracked yet, because I'm trying to wrap up some of the other stuff in her first. But I do want to get to that at some point. Yeah, so totally. And okay, and you brought up James, and James has a lot of stuff about how just reminding people that belief is about you being part of the story of what gets believed. There has to be something in you that is believing it. It's not that like you're there and then I just like shoot like evidence at you and then you like believe all of a sudden, like I can shoot you with a bullet and kill you, right? If it's not actually a genuinely chosen belief unless it was an option, right?
Yeah,
and
and I would say there are a lot of beliefs that you do just shoot evidence at someone and then they start to believe it. Maybe you disagree about that, but like I think you can have like really compelling like statistical analysis about something, or like a really good experiment done that just like everyone who sees it knows about it goes like, okay, yeah, that's true. And like if you understand what's happening, you're just forced to assent to it. And so there's really not a choice that's happening there. But the mistake that we often make in our contemporary society is to assume that that describes the only way, the set of all possible ways by which you come to hold beliefs. And what Cuneo is pushing back against here is that idea. There are, in fact, ways to hold beliefs that involve choice and freedom and not deterministic outcomes of the evidence gun.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think in like James's language, it'd be a discrete number of live options that you would have to have when making what he's describing as like the choice. Because if you're making a choice between two options, one of them is a dead option. It's not something that you could actually assent to, just because of the overwhelming evidence against it, and the other one is just so live because the evidence is so much in favor of it. Then you're being overwhelmed by the evidence and you're not making a real moral choice. But it's when you're faced with a situation where you have multiple discrete live options, where you actually have genuine choices between them and you have good reason for all of them, and now you just have to find one that you can make a part of yourself and to actually like live with it.
But and the question about what you're saying though is in these cases where you can actually have your mind changed by evidence in some way, it's without a doubt that the evidence or something like that is influential on your decision, right? Because we notice patterns where people will be provided with a lot of evidence, or many people will be provided with some definitive survey of the facts, and they'll change their mind because of that opinion, right? Especially if it's a relatively inconsequential matter, like whether or not it was raining here 2,000 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So, but the question is, even in that process, is there a conscious assent of, oh, I realize that it is practically meaningful for me to now assent to this proposition given the evidence? Or is it that some choices are you saying that there's another class of, because this is the secondary literature on the will to believe essay very much focuses around this kind of point, where the interpretation is that James is saying that we should pretty much be scientists and updating towards the evidence all the time, except for in the few cases that we can't, like on certain kinds of religious matters, and then we follow our passional spirit, like James says. So, or is the passional spirit always involved in some way? And I think the better interpretation is that the that underlying, I realize there are multiple interpretations that I could accept. This is a genuine option, and I decide to go this. That's all James is saying, that's always involved in some way. And I think that's closely related to his deep commitment to ideas about free will. And so it's not that anything that you said is precisely wrong, but it's not that there's a lot of the times we're coerced by the evidence and we're just like updating all of our stuff about the world. And then there's certain times where we can't, like on religious questions. It's rather that he's saying this is always a part of how we look at the world. And yeah, I'm just repeating myself, but yeah.
Go ahead.
Just I think maybe the more analytic philosophers, not that I know too much about their whole way of looking at things, but when they tend to read that James essay, and especially people that read that James essay and not much else, think of it in the way that most things are normal scientific, good experimental science questions where we take evidence in and then we believe what the evidence tells us. And then sometimes when you can't have evidence, but you need to answer a question, you follow your passional nature, or it's permitted to follow your passional nature. But if you read all of James, especially essays like The Dilemma of Determinism, which I've only read a couple of times, which I want to dig further into because I think it's got a lot of keys in there. He's very clear that like you're always making these kinds of genuine options, even though he doesn't use that word in that essay.
That's interesting. I don't know anything about the James scholarship, obviously. You know much more than me there. I'd be inclined to say what I think is true about how we how many of our, or what proportion of our beliefs are deterministic in that kind of updating way that you talked about. I would say that the first thing is that the vast majority of things that we can believe are not forced options. And so the fact that they're not forced puts us in a situation where, with respect to most things, we can actually suspend judgments and just like not have beliefs about like a very large number of things that are going on around us. And then those situations where there are forced, where the belief is a forced decision that you have to make, I find pretty often that there's only one live option for me, to use that other word from James. And in those cases, I would say there is like a sense of determinism that's going on there. So I don't know if it's this kind of scientific like update with the evidence or whatever. And I definitely don't want to say that that's like always normative for everyone, that everyone always is or ought to be updating with the evidence, as you put it. But for me, I find myself about the number of beliefs that I hold on the basis of a kind of passional decision making is really small relative to the number of beliefs I hold on the basis of a kind of deterministic sort of framework. I would think, for the simple reason that in all of those cases that aren't based on like an emotional decision, there is only one live option, because evidence presents itself really forcefully to me, and then I'm just like persuaded instantly. Maybe you could say there's an element of choice in that as well. Surely there is, like on a more fundamental level. Like I fundamentally choose to approach reality in a way that allows my mind to be shaped by evidence, and so maybe that is a matter of choice. Fundamentally, I'm not sure, but as a matter of fact, I would say, or as a matter of like experience, as a matter of phenomenology, it feels like most of my beliefs I don't choose, but some of them I do.
So that phenomenal experience, I think that James and Peirce, who I've been reading a lot more of recently, have a word that they use for that kind of experience, which they just call habit, and that most things are in a condition of habit. So something that's entirely material. Peirce has this term where he says that matter is effete mind, or mind that has found very peculiar patterns that it's always going to follow. So like rocks can't choose, but they are still spiritual because they have a pattern to them, and they're never going to choose like which position they go into. They have like very deep ingrained habits, just like humans have habits of how like our reflexes or our instincts or something like that we evolved to use. But and then also what you said about there being some kind of fundamental choice that we're making deeper down, that we choose like that we choose, well, I'm going to approach the world in this way. And you can think of it like as a strategy of, like, let's say there's many different people always trying to give me evidence, and I can develop some kind of strategy. Like, I'm going to trust Caleb whenever he tells me something, but I'm not going to trust Tegan whenever he tells me something. And then I get into that pattern, but it was based on some forced choice at one point, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Yeah. That might be true. I'm not sure. I don't want to commit to that, but that sounds plausible.
And so another phrase that Peirce uses and that James uses a lot too, or just kind of something that you can sum up as part of the theme of the whole pragmatist project, and especially Peirce really, is that chance begets order. So just because you're not referring to these explicit patterns of how these things are related, doesn't mean you can't have order, which obviously has familiarity with what we know in econ from stuff like the invisible hand or Hayek and spontaneous order and stuff like that. And they have a technical definition of chance, which is something that has higher degrees of independence from other things. So in genetic like in Darwin, random variation or independent variation, we would call chance with respect to the rest of the environment. Even though we can talk about like the physics of how DNA gets together, we call it chance because it's relatively independent of the environment in which that DNA is going to be tested for the survival of the fittest, right? So yeah, and so so these patterns that you're describing, where you have a lot of evidence, or you're presented with a lot of evidence, and then you observe beliefs afterwards, does not negate the idea that chance is involved, that genuine choice is involved in what people are doing. Mm-hmm. And so but the main phrase that James, or like the flashy phrase that he uses in, I think it's in Dilemma of Determinism, is that his first act of free will is going to be to believe in free will. So there's always this element of like choosing that you're basically, so like if you think of like a bad habit that you have, you're somewhat controlled by the habit, but you're not totally controlled by the habit. So how do you find, what is that middle in between you controlling something and it controlling you, even if you can kind of get out of its control, right? What's the difference between those things? You know who uses, this is an interesting person to bring up, Mises. Ludwig von Mises in Human Action has a section that he calls Ideological Might, which is where he says, like, sometimes we're in discussion and then like you bring up an idea and then I bring up an idea, but that idea itself is so powerful over everyone's mind that it just like dominates all of us, right? And we just believe it all of a sudden. And it's very unclear whether or not he's saying like, well, ideological might is just this thing that explains why some false things show up, or he's trying to say, as a thinker, you should try to make your ideas more mighty. Like that's actually part of the, like there, as if, or what I think he might actually think of it in the pejorative sense, in that there's rational thinking people that understand truth and how to do science and stuff like that, but then like fascism and communism and socialism shows up and it hijacks like some part of their brain, and so these ideas have might, and it's might over right, as opposed to the way that pragmatists might think about it, or the way that we're talking about ideas, where our job as thinkers is to make our ideas more mighty so that they win out in these intellectual combats. Mm-hmm. Right, that's what it means to be a better rhetorician or a better thinker, is to arm your ideas with better weapons. Mm-hmm.
I guess I would just append to that a clarification, where there's a very particular kind of might that we're striving for, and it's because in one sense you could say the sophists have mighty ideas, right? Or maybe it's not the ideas that's mighty, but it's a presentation of the idea that's mighty. And so maybe the difference is that what we're trying to do is show that certain ideas, perhaps in themselves, have force to them and ought to be assented to. And we're trying to show that about the ideas, not convince people that ideas have those properties by force of will or deception or something like that, by rhetorical tricks.
Yeah. So like with the sophists, they would be using like rhetoric to disguise the error in their ideas, and to disguise truth to convey something else. Whereas like giving some idea like ideological might, or making an idea mighty, would be to use rhetoric to clarify and to show a true idea for what it is, and letting the truth speak for itself, basically. So where one is using rhetoric to build up some kind of protection to make it more mighty so that it can pass people's judgments, the other would be stripping away all clutter and distractions so that you can have just the truth present itself to people, something like that.
Yeah, perhaps so.
Mhm.
That's a very Platonic way of looking at things.
I haven't read much of Plato, but I'll take it as a compliment.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah, but yeah, so it is hard to think through, because what you're saying is obviously the sophists are doing it wrong, right? They're doing something that we would say is wrong because they're sneaking in falsehoods, right? With the might of their rhetoric. But how do we? But we also think that like Jesus's parables or something like that have a lot of ideological might.
Yeah. Or just the figure of Jesus himself. Like I would say, like one of the reasons, but probably the actually most important reason I'm a Christian is just the image of Jesus on the cross when he says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And the promise of the gospel is that it is twofold. One, that kind of radical love is extended to you, and two, you will be made into the kind of person that can express that radical love toward all creation by the sovereign grace of God. And it's just like, it's that idea has so much might in it for me that it just captures me. And when you think of it in those terms, it's actually really interesting, because is really what's going on there something different than just like what happens when you assent to like a large preponderance of evidence? I don't know. Now I'm talking myself in circles. I'm coming around to see what you're saying, Marcus.
Yeah, I don't know. That's why people don't like it. They want some external test for the idea.
Yeah.
That they want a guide or an authority on truth and falsehood independent of might, right? Like a judge or something like that. But then when you have a good judge, you want that judge to then have might. And then if they have might, and then people start following, then the judge gets to sort things because they have might, then people start to mistrust this judge again, because they go, okay, are we following him because he's a good judge or just because he has might? This is like I guess you would say it's like a perennial problem of trusting anyone with power, because you want to give power to the people who are right, but as soon as you give them that power, people fail to be able to remember whether or not they're following them because they have might or because they're right. And I guess what we want are mechanisms of credible commitment.
Yeah.
Intellectual credible commitment.
Yeah, something where you'll only assent because it's right and not because of the might behind it, something like that.
And find the search for that method is basically the story of the entire Enlightenment of modernism, and the coming to terms with the fact that mechanism can't actually be found characterizes postmodernism in the sense of
knowledge is power.
Modernism.
Yeah.
Well, either that's one way to go about it, or there's the more optimistic kind of way, which is to take the Jamesian pragmatist Polanyian Gadamerarian hermeneutic kind of approach. I think those are all different and better ways of approaching the problem after the breakdown of classical foundationalism.
Yes. Yes, and then obviously in something like this, we want to, and in a discussion of something like this Caneo essay, we want to get over, well, as someone that wants to defend pragmatism, I want to get over stereotypes of pragmatism as being believing what is convenient to you at the time, or what feels good or something like that, because that's not what's meant by what they're writing. They're writing about what something means is how it adds to your life, what a belief which you're choosing to believe or not believe means is how it adds and augments your life and your behavior. So, and that's how you should judge it, as whether or not this is a good additional behavior to your life. It doesn't, so pragmatism does not provide a new authority on the truth. It provides a focusing on your questions of truth and how you are proper, like what the whole reason you're asking questions is in the first place. And then that when you know the reason why you're asking questions, you'll be able to answer them better, but it doesn't answer them for you, because you still have to refer to, I don't know, different authorities or traditions or something like that. Yeah. So like there's a lot of like discussion of philosophy of religion and pragmatism, but and people talk about stuff like belief in God being beneficial, because people then they'll refer immediately to James's psychology and be like, well, James thought you should believe in God because it like makes you not depressed or something like that. And then they're like, and that's about utility, not about truth. So he's like reducing truth to utility, but that's not the point. He's just talking about belief in God means what you're going to do with that belief. So that's why he wants to focus on it and study it. But he doesn't purport to actually answer the question in the psychological studies. He still turns the question back to you and say, you've got these practical issues, and he's just observing people at that point. Yeah,
that's interesting.
So it's interesting stuff. Okay, but what about this? Yeah, this essay. More things in the essay. Obviously, what we're talking about, the really shocking part of the essay, which I encourage everybody to read, right, is that when he says like he does through this whole thing, and it's like 2/3 go through, and he's like, I'm not even sure I believe some of this, and you go like, what? Like,
yeah.
You get like,
that's
it's like
whole
surprising.
commitment thing.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's what I think is easily the most rich part of the essay.
Yeah, definitely, because you do not expect it, because you expect it to be like a normal, like, I was lost and now I'm found kind of thing. But he's like, I was lost and now I'm still pretty lost. But
yeah, except not quite.
Yeah, except
yeah,
not,
but he's a
somebody
structure to work through it.
Yeah, but somebody found me. So like the difference between religion and philosophy sometimes is, in philosophy you're searching for things, and then when you find something that you think is the truth, you're like, I know this and I have this grasp on the rest of the world. Whereas in religion and in interpersonal interactions, and in the best forms of philosophy, I would argue as well, you're not only searching for things and then find them and know them, but there's other things and other people searching for you and they know you too, which is a totally different dynamic. And so you're pulled into things as much as you pull things into you. So like in church, you, like when you pray, you're asking, not that God doesn't know you, but you're asking him to know you in this way. Or when you ask other people to pray for you, and when you take communion and stuff like that, you're joining something else, as opposed to like eating up apples of like, this is content, I'm just gonna eat them up or whatever, you know? So that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Probably that's what Platonic philosophy is, to be honest. But like the forms knowing you just as much as you know the forms. So like when he says like, yeah, I'm not even totally sure I know God or know these beliefs or what they mean, it doesn't really matter. If he already chose to join the church, then that's what is giving him comfort, or that's why it's not like he's dissing the church by saying something like that.
Right.
The church is not judged by simply how you relate to it, it's also how it relates to you, which is different than just like reading through books or whatever.
Yeah, and he uses the example of both Thomas and then the man in the Gospels who says, "Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief." And I think that line from the Gospels really encapsulates what he's getting at there. That he has a belief and is making a commitment to these beliefs, even though at any given moment, like, he might rank them at a low probability, but he still like acts as if they are true because he sees them as better beliefs than the alternatives. Then he also talks about how the Orthodox readings for or chants for the day of St. Thomas the Sunday after Pascha, how they say, "Oh, good unbelief of Thomas," and how much good comes from this unbelief. And yeah, he's definitely not putting forward some kind of system where you just like check off all the boxes and then you're good to go. Like it's a lot more of wrestling and searching, and wrestling with God is you wrestling God and him wrestling back. It's the image of Jacob wrestling Christ. And so there's this dynamic element instead of just like you're saying, if you check off the doctrinal boxes and then you can just say, okay, yeah, here's my ticket, I'm a member. You know, it's a lot more of a dynamic process of being a part of community and seeking a God who's also seeking to know and love you as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
I also love, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you go ahead.
I was just to say, related to that, in that same section where we're talking about where Kine is talking about being a doubter but not a skeptic. He has this line. He says, I learned not to take my doubts too seriously, because so often my doubts are just the product of like my mood, of what I've been around, what problems I've been fixating on too much and stuff like that. And I just think that's such a breath of fresh air to hear, because like we live in this age where people are just like, they're actually not that skeptical all the time, but they're skeptical about like enough things, and that we generally seem to enshrine a kind of rigid skepticism as a virtue, right? Like where skepticism is your mind operating rightly and you're like looking at everything suspiciously, and if you're too trusting, then that's like your emotions getting the better of you. He's like, no, you're like your doubts, your skepticism is just as much the product of your own idiosyncrasies as where you put your trust and stuff like that. And so you have to learn not to take your doubts too seriously. And I think that's just like such a good epistemological principle, just a really profound hermeneutic insight, beyond even philosophy of religion, though it has an obvious application here.
Yeah, and that's very related to one of the things that when I first listened to Peterson, like clicked for me hard, because in the if you're thinking of just a basic religion or no religion question, it seems like the side that the atheists or new atheist types make a pretty convincing case that if there's bias in this question, if there's any bias, it's towards religion, right? Because in religion you get to go to heaven and you don't die, and there's a guy that's always loves you and he's always watching out for you, and these are all comforting notions. Like if you're very anxious about death or something like that, and then you just go, oh wait, I bet I get to go to heaven, then you're comforted, right? Or something like that, and then you're like you're released from this stress or something like that. So there's a bias towards believing that, right? Or if a loved one dies, you get to see them again in heaven. That one's focused on a lot, because I think actually that's Freud's main thing, is that he has explained religion through anxiety of death. That was his main focus. And he's obviously very influential. But then Peterson was like, okay, yeah, sure. Like, of course, people have anxieties about death, and they might justify strange things to get over that anxiety. But there's the same problem the other way, because if you say at the end of the day nothing matters, then you can get over all of these. You can like ignore all these responsibilities, and like all of a sudden, like if you have all these anxieties about I need to do this, I need to do that, because I need to like take care of my family, and I need to like do good things for the world, and because I need to like improve the state of the world, you can just use these materialistic beliefs to justify and just comfort yourself. Oh wait, it doesn't matter. Right? I could just roll around in the mud all day and like eat chicken and whatever. I guess that's my like subconscious like things I would do if there was no God. Like, roll around in the mud and eat chicken. What else?
Yeah, that sounds like you.
Yeah.
I guess I do a lot of things. But I'd eat a tree. Probably I'd eat a tree if there was no God. And like that sounds great.
Yeah.
So I have a bias to not be religious or something. Also, obviously, like the bias of looking cool and pride and being edgy and stuff like that. Like just the fact there are biases in the other way. Just as soon as you notice that, like, oh, wait, the cards are not stacked against, like you realize that the cards were in the debate, coming into the debate, by excluding those things, the cards were stacked against religion in terms of this, what is the rational approach? Then
Yeah.
obviously you can explain everyone's belief on one side by bias, but you can explain it the other way as well, right? So like Sarumanism, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, so that's all cool stuff. And that was what I got. That was one of the big things for me about Peterson, is that he just said, maybe not. Like, maybe that's not the default. Like, why would that be the default? You know? And then you have to, why would that be the side that it needs the burden of proof?
Yeah.
So the base state should not be skepticism, it should be confusion, which seems to be Peterson's base state about everything. He's constantly confused. I don't get this. Why? You know?
Yeah. And then he's like, explain this to me. And then they start explaining. He's like, yes, that's what I want to understand. Explain it to me. And they're like, I'm trying. Just let me talk.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But then, so that's why the few things that he is very confident about, he keeps them holds them so preciously, because he's like, oh, I'm so confident that responsibility matters, and I'll be like, it's because that's solid ground for him, and otherwise he's floating in midair. But he's very attracted to like opposite things at the same time, you know.
Yeah.
Which is obviously, there's a reason to stay there, but it's going to be confusing. Yeah. But not exactly skeptical. So you wouldn't call Peterson a skeptic. You'd call him confused.
Yeah, because he's skeptical of skepticism, of the benefits of it. So you can't call him a skeptic if he's also uncertain of the benefits that come down the road of going down the road of being a skeptic, as uncertain as he is about going down the road of any particular religion. So yeah, he's just confused in that he actually has no path to go down. He doesn't have the edgy atheist path or the like traditional Christian path or any of the branches that come off of that.
Have either of you read The Concept of Anxiety by Kierkegaard?
I haven't.
I might read that soon. Yeah.
I haven't, but I have it, and I think James has read it. Yeah, I have it, and I think James. Cool. I think
Your
James read my copy.
Not William James.
Yeah, different.
Even though maybe William James read it. I read an article once about James's how much of Kierkegaard James read. Kierkegaard has that famous phrase that you live life forwards, but you understand it backwards. And some guy that was like a Kierkegaard scholar, like, you know, right after Kierkegaard died, like in the 1800s, came to Harvard and like said that, and James was like, oh, yeah, that's sick. And so James like quotes that a couple times.
Huh, that's funny. I didn't know that. That's interesting. Yeah. Very cool.
Because that totally fits James's, like the way that James's stuff works. You know, I guess, oh, look, you're reading here, it says the first time it was translated into English was 1946. So that, we always forget that about like philosophy before like the mid 20th century. So sometimes it's like, can't read that, it's in another language. Because like there wasn't like nonstop translation going on. Like if there's a book now, it's like given like translated at least into English, right? So like when we've been doing stuff in the Hayek program, and it's like, yeah, so this is the first translation of Carl Menger's thing into English, and we're like, what the heck? I feel like someone would have translated that already, because it's Carl Menger, right? It's a big deal. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Any other concluding thoughts that you guys have?
I would just like to say that one of the things that I found really fascinating and engaging was he talks about how he was always kind of frustrated and confused by how people would treat Easter when he was growing up in like an evangelical world, of how you knew Christmas time was coming around because there are snowmen, there are presents, and there are people singing songs about Jesus for the entire month in the Kmart or whatever. And like you have all this preparation for Christmas, and how with Easter it would come and pass as, you know, just a moment, and you'd forget that it's Easter this week, and then you'd forget that it happened by the next week, and there's nothing really special or kind of importance given to Easter as opposed to Christmas. And I kind of really empathize with this a lot because I was always kind of frustrated with how little attention was given to Easter when I was growing up. And so coming into the Orthodox Church where you're fasting for like 8 weeks or something to get ready for Pascha, and then you have just this midnight service on Pascha, and it's like 3 hours, and you're processing around the building, and you're doing so much, and you're all participating as a church, and like everyone, even the people who are like only there because like their grandparents were Romanian or something, everyone is there, and you're all coming together, and it's just like it's so much more to engage with, and the liturgical calendar is always present, and you have this periods of feasting and fasting that gives so much like rhythm to your life, as opposed to like Easter just being like something that just shows up on your calendar that, oh, I guess it's Easter this week. Was something that I really connected with, and I love to see how he enjoyed to grapple with and to engage with something that was so much more like, I don't know, participatory with Easter as opposed to what you grew up with, because I connect with that a lot.
Yeah, it's April 24th this year. If you want to come, Tegan, it's gonna be baller.
April 24th is Orthodox Easter.
Yeah.
Western Easter is April 17th.
Nice. 2 Easters. Let's go.
Yeah.
Let's turn up.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, okay, this was a really good conversation though.
Wait. Can I finish with?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to read a segment to give your listeners a taste of like what this essay is, because it's not a long essay, and they should read it because it's really great. And this paragraph, I think, is the best part. So he finishes the previous paragraph. He says, "In my darkest moments of doubt, when I have worried that what I hold dear is false, I have often asked myself whether there is anything better on the other side. As best I can tell, the answer is no. I do not see how a life in which I drink coffee on Sunday mornings instead of participating in the liturgy is better. I do not see how a life that has no rhythm of fasting and feasting, no structure in which one can communally express grief and hope, is better than one that does not have such a rhythm and structure. I do not see how a life in which on Easter I do little more than collect chocolate-filled plastic eggs with my children is better than one in which I sing the hymns of the church with my children, expressing defiant hope in the face of death. On this matter, I do not wish to be misunderstood. The secular life does not seem to me meaningless, but the secular life does seem to me considerably less rich than that offered by Orthodox Christianity. In comparison to what I know, it looks to me empty. When I have tried on the secular life, that is how it has felt, at least."
Awesome. And we'll conclude there. So thanks for talking, guys, and we'll see you soon.